Thank you, Richard, for that very kind introduction. Mr. Richard Mills, Chairman of the Asia CEO Forum, Ms. Rebecca Bustamante, my good friend, Dr. Bernie Villegas, and other distinguished guests, friends from the business sector. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. I want to thank Richard and Rebecca for having invited me to this breakfast forum. And I want to thank all of you for your presence this morning. It's a pleasure to see quite a number of familiar faces. Some of them are my colleagues in companies that I serve in the board, like AIG Shared Services and FWD Insurance, and as well as many other friends. I have been asked by Richard to talk a little bit about my challenges as ambassador to the United States, Filipino ambassador to the US, as well as some of the major accomplishments. But first, let me just give a brief background. I was appointed as Philippine ambassador to the US by President Aquino on November 30, 2010. I was confirmed by the Commission of Appointments on February 9th. I received my agrement from the US government. That's the agreement to allow me to come to the US to represent the Philippines on March 18, 2011. And I formally assumed my position as Philippine ambassador to the US on April 2nd. When I look back, I was in the US for 5 years and 3 months, probably a little bit longer than I expected. Most of my, well, I guess all my colleagues from the ASEAN countries who were there when I arrived had left. So I was the longest serving ASEAN ambassador at that point. There were 4 Thai ambassadors during that period, 3 from Malaysia, and the other countries 2 each. So I was the longest serving ambassador. When I look back, I certainly feel that I accomplished the mandate that was given to me by President Benigno Aquino and Secretary Albert de Rosario, and I thank them for having given me the opportunity to serve. I had no plans to become a diplomat. In July 2010, I was called by Ambassador Bobby Romulo, a very good friend and former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and asked if I would be willing to take an ambassadorial assignment to Spain. And I said, oh, why not? Spain, very nice country. But when I spoke to my wife that evening, that was immediately shut down, so that was the end of it. I was again asked by Secretary Bert Romulo in September whether I would take an assignment. I asked him where, and he said, well, it's up to you, London, Washington, whatever. And I said, oh yeah, but let me tell you that my wife already turned down my first request. And that same evening, I asked her, again, it was turned down. But the third time, it was Albert de Rosario who approached me early November, and I think he was more persistent. So I told him that I was turned down by my wife twice, but he said, no, let's try again. Let's try to convince her. I will talk to her, and then there were many other friends who offered to intercede, watch Sisip, Ramon de Rosario, etc. They all failed to convince my wife. The only one who was able to make her change her mind was her spiritual advisor, who told her, Vicky, it's not about you. It's about Joey. He's willing to serve. Why aren't you going to let him? And that's when she finally agreed. Well, anyway, that's how I became the Philippine ambassador to the US. When I arrived in Washington, I got a briefing. As you know, that was my first diplomatic assignment. I got a briefing from the embassy staff. I also had a briefing here in Manila, but it was not as extensive as the briefing I got in the US. So I found out that there were quite a number of challenges that I had to immediately tackle. The first one was the fact that we had been downgraded by the FAA to Category 2 in terms of our aviation rating. There were 17 points that had been raised by the FAA, particularly with regard to safety, the lack of qualified inspectors, the lack of manuals in terms of operations manuals by the airlines, etc., etc. We were downgraded 2008 during the term of President Arroyo. Unfortunately, nothing happened during the time from 2008 until late 2010 or early 2011 when President Aquino found out about this, was brought to his attention, and he immediately ordered the CAAP to immediately tackle the issues that were. Unfortunately, the head of the CAAP at that time was not, well, I guess, as engaged as his subsequent replacement Director General William Hotchkiss. So by when I became the ambassador, one of the first things I did was contacted the CAAP, the Civil Aviation Authority, and I said, what are you doing about this? It's been so long, and it took Mexico 1 year to be able to regain Category 1. What are we doing? It's been more than 3 years. So fortunately, Director General Hotchkiss and his team immediately got to work. It took almost a year before they were able to address all 17 issues. But we were very happy that shortly before the visit of President Barack Obama in April 2014, that was, I think, in March, late March or early April, we were restored to Category 1, but not without a lot of challenges. I said, there was one time when I know when one of the senior officials of CAAP was telling me, Ambassador, we've already met the ICAO standards. That's the ICAO. And I said, it's not enough that we meet the ICAO standards. We have to meet what FAA requires. And he said, well, why should we do that? And I said, look, if you want to fly to the US, we've got to meet FAA standard. You can't determine what the US will tell us. So finally, well, they did what, as I said, what the FAA required, and fortunately, we got our Category 1 rating restored. I think the other very important thing is that we were able to convince the CAAP to engage the FAA on a technical assistance program for about 2 years to ensure that we would not revert back to Category 2, that we would not backslide, etc. And despite the significant amount that they had to pay, they agreed to do it. And I'm very glad because up to now, we have maintained that rating, and I think we are assured that the CAAP has seriously acknowledged or seriously considered the importance of maintaining this rating. Now, the second challenge was that we were part of this special 301 watch list. And what does that mean? We were one of the countries that had been identified for not having provided adequate protection for intellectual property rights. We were not enforcing our IPO laws, etc., etc. And again, it was only when Director General Blanca Flor took over that they really seriously addressed all the concerns raised by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the USTR, which, of course, recommended that the Philippines be in that 301 list. Over a period of about 3 years, again, we worked with the Department of Trade and Industry, the IPO office, and other agencies in the Philippines. And after about 3 years, in fact, I recall I had to make a special appearance at the committee, the IPO committee in the part of the USTR or U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and I made our case. And a few months after that, we were informed that the committee had decided to remove the Philippines from that watch list. So that was the second, of course, triumph we had in terms of the challenges that we faced. On the third challenge was we had a case that was brought by some groups against the Philippines in terms of our what they call the generalized systems of preference, where the Philippines, together with 121 other countries, enjoys preferential treatment for certain products. Now, that privilege, however, is dependent on the country being able to prove that it respects labor rights. And that was the allegation against us, that we were not protecting the rights of workers. We convinced Secretary Baldos and, in fact, some other undersecretaries to make their case in the U.S. In fact, she visited twice, and I think 2 other undersecretaries came to Washington to be able to argue our case. We were able to show them that the Philippines passed additional legislation. There were 4 legislation that they wanted to see the Philippines enact. 3 of the 4 were passed by Congress. The last one was something that the Department of Labor refused to recommend, and we also agreed with them. And that particular legislation would have weakened the power of the Secretary of Labor to intervene in strikes. And we told the USTR that it was very important for the Philippines to ensure that the Secretary of Labor had that right, and that the Secretary of Labor had judiciously used her powers. She actually pointed out to them that she hardly intervened unless it was to ensure the interests of national interest. And despite the fact that that legislation was not passed, the U.S. government agreed. We showed them the fact that there was stability in labor management relations. There were only 2 strikes, I think that was in 2014, versus our other neighbors where, for example, Vietnam had more than 200 strikes, China had more than 300 strikes. So we were able to convince them that, that we did not have to pass that legislation. And they agreed, so we were removed. The case was dropped, and of course, that was, I think, another victory for the Philippines, because that sword hung over our heads for about 3 or 4 years. And with that case being removed, we were assured that we could enjoy our GSP privileges the years ahead. We were the 5th largest user of GSP in 2013 or 2014, $1.25 billion of goods that entered the U.S. market duty-free using the GSP privileges. And I hope that we can continue with that. Now, probably the biggest challenge we had was that the Philippines was included as part of the Tier 2 watch list in the Trafficking in Persons report of the State Department. So from 2011, when I first came in, we were already on the watch list. Despite the efforts we had, for another year, we were in that watch list, and I kept telling Secretary Laila de Lima, who was then chair of the IACAT, that we had to put a lot more attention on this Trafficking in Persons report. Fortunately, Secretary de Lima responded very positively. She got all the agencies who were involved, and they worked on it. What we had to do was to prove that we were enforcing the laws against trafficking, that we were going after the traffickers. And in fact, the following year, I think by 2013, we showed a very significant increase in terms of convictions. We passed additional legislation to strengthen our laws against trafficking. And by 2013, we moved up to Tier 2. Tier 2, partially meeting all these obligations in terms of going after trafficking, but not enough. The highest level, of course, in Tier 1 is Tier 1. Well, I was very happy that on June 30, my last day in Washington, D.C., I actually left on the 29th. But on the 29th, we got a report from the State Department, and I was told, this is embargoed, and you cannot say anything about this until the next day, June 30th, because the report was coming out on the 30th. We're happy to tell you that the Philippines has been elevated to Tier 1. I was so happy because I kept telling Ambassador Susan Southledge that, you know, I wanted to get the Philippines into Tier 1 before President Aquino stepped down. And as if to give me a gift, a send-off gift, on June 30, they told us the Philippines had been elevated to Tier 1. And, you know, what's the significance of that? We are the only Southeast Asian country that that's in Tier 1. Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, no, I'm sorry, Singapore, Vietnam, Brunei are part of Tier 2. Malaysia is Tier 2 watch list. Thailand was Tier 3. Thailand and Myanmar was Tier 2 watch list. So we are the only Southeast Asian countries in Tier 1. I'm trying to well, I can't find the exact wording. But anyway, the important thing is that we were able to convince the State Department, including the U.S. Embassy here, that we had done enough to justify our movement into Tier 1. So today, we're the only Southeast Asian country in Tier 1. So that's the, as I said, the biggest challenge we faced, and we hope that we can maintain that, category or that rating in the years ahead. Now let me move to, within the economic, let me just mention, of course, some major accomplishments. Our Partnership for Growth and the MCC, or the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Under the Partnership for Growth, we are the only Asian country that was included in that White House initiative. Over the past 5 years, we have received over $700 million for both the Partnership for Growth and the MCC. The Partnership for Growth addressed the constraints to achieve maximum economic growth. And the 4 areas were improving regulatory quality, upholding the rule of law, governance and anti-corruption, and 4 was revenue generation. I think we did very well in all 4 areas, and I was told by the head of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Daniel Johannes, who is now the U.S. ambassador to the OECD, that the Philippines, in fact, can be held up as a model for the Partnership for Growth because of our performance. And I was, of course, very happy to hear that. When the Millennium Challenge Corporation report was issued in May 2016, just this year, at the end of the first compact. By the way, that MCC, we received $434 million for 3 major projects. A highways project in Samar, one of the poorest provinces in the country, 224-kilometer highway, and the community development project of the DSWD, and the third was the revenue generation program to improve the BIR's capability to collect taxes. Again, in all 3 projects, we did very well. And this is why in December 2014, the MCC board declared the Philippines eligible for a second compact. It is not, normal for a country to get a second compact. In fact, again, the same Daniel Johannes told me when I asked him what's the possibility of getting a second compact, I tendered a dinner for him at my residence, and he said, Ambassador, you've done so well. You've also moved up to the low middle income country, and I doubt that you're going to be able to get a second compact. So when we were told in December 2014 or 2015 that we were deemed eligible by the MCC board, we were very happy to hear about it. Right now, the Philippine government and the US government are working on projects that can be approved. The decision will probably come out in the fall of 2017, but what I'm happy about this is that there's going to be greater focus on agriculture, and that happens to be part of the 10-point economic program of the Duterte administration, so I'm very happy about that. So those are two major. Of course, we have other accomplishments. I have to acknowledge Dr. Bernie Villegas, who, by the way, led the private sector CEO mission to 12 cities in the US over the past, over a period of 4 years. Dr. Villegas and the CEOs from various sectors, Sid Consunji of the MCI, Philip Romualdez of mining, of Benguet, Gigi Zulueta of Ward Howell, Giorgio Dispo of First Metro on financial services, and many others. We had the representatives from pharmaceuticals and biotech. They joined us in these 12 cities around the US to tell the US business firms the narrative of the Philippine economic transformation. We were very well received, and again, I thank Dr. Villegas and his team because we achieved so much. Thank you, Bernie. Again, I'm glad I can acknowledge what you did. I'll tell you one example. We were in, I think, Philadelphia or Atlanta, I'm not sure. And they said, how come we don't know this great story about the Philippines? And I felt like telling them, maybe you don't read the international papers. But it just shows that we really need to go out. And this is why I had to really go around. I visited 44 states around the US, but I'm getting a little bit ahead. Let me talk also about the military and security alliance that we have with the US. So I don't just focus on the economic relationship. When I arrived there, again, this president said, see what you can do about enhance or trying to get more military assistance from the US. So I immediately tackled that. I had to meet with State Department, the Pentagon officials, and the officials who are in charge of excess defense articles. Well, our efforts yielded the following. We were able to get 2 cutters from the US Coast Guard, the USS Hamilton, which is now the BRP Del Pilar, and the USS Dallas, which is now the BRP Alcaraz. They're now the working horses of the Philippine Navy. They do the patrols in the West Philippine Sea. We got a 3rd cutter, which will be arriving sometime in August, the USS Boutwell. I don't know whether they've renamed it, but I'm sure that they'll be using a Philippine name as soon as it arrives. We also got an oceanographic vessel. It's now called the BRP Velasquez that will help us to do monitoring of our maritime domain, particularly in our West Philippine Sea territory. So those, aside from that, of course, we got radar equipment, we got armored vehicles, we got radar communications equipment, etc. But we also got a National Coast Guard Center that was fully funded by FMF. Our FMF, or Foreign Military Financing, when I arrived in Washington, was about $15 million. For 2 years, it was $15 million. But we were also fortunate to have a champion in the person of Senator Daniel Inouye, who on his own would increase the allocation that was requested by the executive department, because he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and a very good friend of the Philippines. So we saw our FMF increase from 15 million in 2011. We hit a record $66 million in 2015. And 2016, I understand that the proposal of the Obama administration is $40 million. But over that period, we got over $180 million in just FMF alone. In terms of total military and economic assistance, over $1.3 billion for that 6-month period. Now, what was the challenge in terms of the West Philippine Sea? We knew that although the incursions into our waters started in 2009, it became, as you recall, there was this confrontation with China in April 2012, when we had 8 ships. We had mostly, well, I think there's 1 Coast Guard vessel and 1 vessel from the Bureau of Fisheries, and about 6 or 7 fishing boats that were confronted by about 77 Chinese vessels, a number of Coast Guard, a number of fisheries vessels, and so many fishing boats from China. So things were getting so tense. I was approached by the State Department and said, Ambassador, maybe, we can have some kind of a measure to ease tensions. And I said, what do you suggest? Well, maybe the Philippines can withdraw the vessels and then China will follow. I said, no, can't be. It's got to be simultaneous. And I'm willing to recommend it for as long as it is going to be a simultaneous withdrawal of vessels. And so the State Department Assistant Secretary Campbell said, okay, I will talk to the Chinese ambassador. So they did. And at that time, I think the Vice Foreign Minister of China was also there, Fu Ying. And so we came to an agreement. We agreed on a certain date, June 4 at 8 a.m. There would be simultaneous withdrawal. Actually, President Aquino was very reluctant at the beginning, but both Secretary De Rosario and I strongly recommend, because we felt that that was the only way to ease the tensions. We were at a huge disadvantage. We could not confront China. So President Aquino eventually agreed. However, on June 4, day of the withdrawal, we withdrew our vessels. China did not. So I immediately called Secretary Carter. I said, what's happening? He says, yeah, I have to call. So he called the ambassador, and he said, oh, give us more time. We will withdraw. Well, make it long story short, they did not withdraw. So when the ASEAN ambassadors met with the assistants, we meet every month, I said, Kurt, I'm going to say this publicly. I hope you don't mind. And so I said, I made it very clear. We had this agreement with China. China breached the agreement. We adhered to the agreement. He confirmed it in the presence of all the ASEAN ambassadors. And I'm sure the Cambodian ambassador, Laos, must have made a report right away. And I wanted that, to reach China. And true enough, they did make a report. But that didn't help, because China, one day they withdrew the vessels, the next day they brought back the vessels. Secretary De Rosario was recommending that we bring back vessels. President Aquino did not want to have a confrontation with China. So he said, no, we will not bring it. So what did we decide? Well, because of that, we decided precisely to file that case in The Hague. January 2013, we can, because there was the diplomatic solution were not working out. We tried to get ASEAN to intervene. ASEAN didn't want to get involved. So finally, we brought the case to The Hague. Well, I think that's history. You know that just a few weeks ago, July 12, we received a favorable ruling from the arbitral tribunal deciding in our favor. We were so pleased that of the 15 petitions, 14 were granted, and we were quite happy that we did not expect the decision to be so, so much in favor of the Philippines. And this is why I think China has been very upset. We are quite happy. Now, the question is, who's going to enforce it? Well, that's the problem. There's no enforcing mechanism. There's even the UN that cannot enforce that. However, we are hoping that someday, maybe not soon, China will realize that it is to their own interest to also follow this ruling. It is, if they want to be a major power, they must be able to uphold the rule of law. They must be able to respect international law. They're a signatory to UNCLOS, and there's no reason why they cannot. Now, I don't have really much time, but let me talk. So that the military, and say I've talked a little bit about that. I think, just one more point. The EDCA, which was signed in April 2014, was challenged by some small groups. Fortunately, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the agreement, and furthermore, that it is an executive agreement, does not require the ratification of the Senate. What's the importance of EDCA? It will enable the U.S. to assist us in terms of building up the capacity of the Philippine Armed Forces. It will also enhance the interoperability of our two militaries. And that's very important because when we have exercises, the U.S. uses a lot more modern equipment. With these joint exercises, we're allowed the use of this equipment. Our people are able to train, and eventually we hope to get some more modern equipment for the armed forces. So that EDCA will strengthen the capability of our Philippine armed forces. Fortunately, also, President Aquino has set aside substantial resources, almost 3 times what was set aside by the 3 previous administrations over a period of 15 years. President Aquino set a budget of, that's almost 3 times as much. So we're seeing, of course, the arrival of these trainer jets. We're getting more vessels that will enable the Navy to do a better patrolling of the West Philippine Sea. And hopefully in a few years, we will see a much stronger Navy, Philippine Navy, as well as Philippine Air Force. Let me now go to the last item. In terms of the third pillar of our foreign policy, I mentioned national security, economic diplomacy. The third is assistance to nationals. We did quite a bit of helping our Filipino workers. Just one example, we had workers in this Gulf of Mexico, and you must have read about that huge explosion, the oil platform explosion, where 3 Filipinos perished, 3 others were seriously injured, and 3, fortunately, escaped unscathed. So the 3, unfortunately, Filipino, they were being blamed because the company said that they did not understand English. I went on television to refute that statement of that CEO of Black Elk, and I said, these Filipino workers have been working in other countries where they speak English, Australia, Saudi Arabia, etc., and it is your negligence. And I was vindicated because the bureau that's in charge of oil platforms came out just last year, November last year, indicting the companies, both Black Elk, the oil company in charge, and the company that they had engaged as their recruiter, Grand Isle Shipyards, because of their negligence. And fortunately, the families of these Filipinos, we provided them legal assistance. Well, we referred to them law firms that would help them. And I think they've gotten very substantial settlements from this company. But we have lost track because I think one of the provisions was that they could not speak about the settlement. We did not want to really know anyway. We just wanted to make sure that they had been taken care of. So we've also extended our consular services by having consular teams go to various states. That would then allow the Filipino Americans who need extensions of passports and so on to go to those consular outreach and not have to travel to the consulates, whether it is Washington or New York or San Francisco, and we saved them a lot of money. That has been very well received by the Filipino community in the U.S. By the way, we have 3.4 million Filipino Americans in the U.S. That's not counting the undocumented aliens. But one thing I can tell you that, again, the Bureau of Census came out with a report that the Filipinos have the lowest poverty rate among the Asian minorities. In fact, the second highest median income of $76,000 per annum. They have the lowest unemployment rate among Asian minorities. And I found that out. When I visited the 44 states, I've always met with the Filipino communities. And one thing I noted that they were all gainfully employed, or most of them anyway, and they had either 2 or 3 jobs. That's one of the things also I found out. The hospital administrators were so pleased with our nurses because they said they're very hardworking, they're very caring, the patients look for them, and that's why they wanted more Filipino nurses in the U.S. And I told them, well, you better write to your ambassador in the Philippines because it's the U.S. Embassy that's been really limiting the number of visas issued to the nurses. And I found out that's because they want to give priority to American nurses. I said, fine. But if there is a shortage, why not give Filipino nurses the ability to come? They've done very well in the U.S. And I hope that we will see more of that. But, you know, it's not only nurses. With a lot of Filipino teachers teaching English, teaching math, etc. We have a lot of IT personnel. So the Filipinos in the U.S. have done so well. And when it comes to remittances from the U.S., still the biggest of all, if you look at all the other countries where Filipino workers send money, bigger than even the Middle East. So with that, let me end because I wanted to give time for some questions that you might have. So thank you again, Richard and Rebecca, for having given me this opportunity.